Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host and friend, Jed Hartley, son of a prophet and former member of the International House of Prayer. Jed, it's so good to be back and so good to say son of a prophet again. I don't know if you've seen it in the comment feeds. I'm just getting dogged because I say this.
Yeah.
I think people don't realize how funny it is to me to say this.
I did see those comments, and it's hard for me to understand how people can't get that we're saying this facetiously, and I like the whole point is that my dad was a prophet in the community, according to everyone within the community throughout all of my upbringing. And it was only until like a year and a half ago that I spoke out and was like, he's not a prophet, that ever any of that was exposed. So yes, I'm not trying to maintain that my father is a genuine prophet of God. That's kind of literally the whole point. But it's a good clarification. So maybe we needed to make it clear.
Well, and it raises the question, Jed, are there prophets?
Are there prophets? Well, that's another thing too, is like, from me, in my perspective, I would be like, anytime anyone's claiming to be a prophet, whether it's someone who's been exposed as a fraud or not, I do not think that we should be throwing that word around in general. So if ever I'm using the word prophet, please know that I'm using it facetiously.
You're killing me, man. People, especially in the Pentecostal and charismatic circles, they'll dog me for that. Anytime I mention that this term prophet, it's thrown around and it's turned into like the superhero of Christian religion. I always go back to the verse Luke 16:16. The law and the prophets were until John, and since then the good news of the kingdom is preached. You don't find that verse preached too many times in the Pentecostal charismatic circle.
I didn't even know about it until I got old enough to be out of the cult.
Yeah. And it's like, I understand the implications of that. Some people want to believe that there are people who can still prophesy, and I have family members who my great-grandmother, I'm told that she had some very, very accurate prophecies. So did it happen? I wasn't there. I don't know. But that's not what the verse says. It doesn't say there will not be prophecy. It says we're not focusing on the prophets. And I can imagine Jesus coming into a world where you've got all of these people who are kind of like today's world. They're self-righteous. They're digging through the law to try to nitpick what are the rules, kind of like a cult. And he comes in and says, no, the law and the prophets were until John. And now we talk about the good news of the kingdom. That's the way it should be.
Yeah. And you and I have talked about the hero worship especially in the like latter rain, New Apostolic Reformation communities, and how dangerous that is. And the term prophet is almost exclusively used in that to provide a sense of hero worship, to make the Bethel culture of honor and the sort of celebrity culture around spiritual leaders, the terminology of prophet, because it doesn't even make sense, because you believe in a world that everybody should be listening and speaking with God and communing with God, and that's the theory behind it. But then yet you have certain individuals who suddenly get the label of doing it, and it is almost, I have never ever seen it not be extremely problematic when it's used.
I don't know that I have seen too many that were real. I have had dreams, and I think I briefly mentioned that, but the gift of prophecy, as it's described in the Bible, manifests itself much differently than a hero on a stage. Sometimes through music, which is, interestingly, it's our topic for today. But in the music, some people, what's within them starts to come out, and you start to, not predict the future. I think that's one of the key differences. The prophets of the the prophets of today, the quote unquote prophets of today, they're really presenting themselves like the fortune tellers of old, not the prophets of old. And so in the music,
Right.
you're starting to see what's really, something from the inside that's coming out naturally versus, hey, we're going to suddenly see the lights come on in the Kansas City Stadium and Joe's Army will appear.
Right. The whole shtick of the International House Prayer is probably marrying those two, the music and the prophecy. That's like the whole thing that I grew up with. And there wasn't a lot of talented musicians. Well, there was always some talented musicians, but like Mike Bickle, my dad, other Bob Jones, these people, the prophets were terrible musicians, all of them, and like had terrible voice. I had to listen to these men stand right next to me and try to like sing gospel songs, and they were all of them tone deaf. But they brought in a lot of people who are excellent musicians. But this is the whole like harp and bowl model. Have we talked about the harp and bowl model?
I don't know that you and I have. I heard the term. Who was it? I think it was with Alwyn when she was talking about IHOP.
Okay.
I was like, I had no clue what she was talking about. Maybe we should.
Yeah. So it's not like something that IHOP invented, but by any means. But there was this. I mean, when you're developing this idea of like 24/7 prayer and worship, you got to get creative with how you keep playing music, because you would have people come in for 2-hour sessions and they would lead music, and like people get sick of the same worship songs, but you would still have these like very repetitive sort of freestyle musics. Like, and what would happen is that you would have like prayer leaders and you would have vocalists who there would be like a call and response between them. So the prayer leader would say something, whether they're prophesying, whether they are talking about a verse from the Bible, or whether it's just this general idea, this line that they're kind of coming up with. Like they would pray, and it would be more free form, and then they would hit on this line, and then you would have the vocalists back up and sing whatever was being prayed. And this is all, of course, with music in the background, and they're kind of playing very freestyle and rotating through their 4-chord progression or whatever it is while this performance is sort of going on. And this is another way that I found out that all of these prophets had terrible voices, because sometimes the people praying would then try to sing too with the backup vocalists, and it was uncomfortable every single time to hear them praying. Wow. But you would have this like extremely repetitive, and this is another aspect when people were like, I remember I always grew up having to like defend IHOP from being called a cult. Like if I heard people from more mainline Christian communities call the International House of Prayer a cult, I'd be like, no, it's definitely not. But the one thing that was always a red flag for me is like the very repetitive, sort of meditative way that the music was played, and there was this sort of call and response, felt very cult-like. And if you went to the prayer room right now and you saw it, and you saw this harp and bowl method, you would get like, yeah, this feels pretty culty.
Yeah. And I'll be honest, I'll break the ice right now. I don't really listen to much Christian music anymore. Not because I don't like it. I truly do. For the first 37 years of my life, that's all I played. This old style Southern gospel quartet style music, not even what was current. I like the old stuff from the 40s and 50s, and I like the bluegrass and this. So my room here is actually, it's a statement more than anything, because there are aspects of this room that I was not allowed to have while in the cult. The drums on this side, for example. So in the Branham religion, there's different splinter groups and different sects. Then
Uh-huh.
within each sect, some of them are more extreme, more fundamentalist, more, I guess I would say they were harsher with their rules.
Right.
And you had people who tried to go above and beyond that and become even more strict because they could get more holy if you did this. In the main sect that I was in the group of people that I was in, the drums were completely forbidden. And I can remember,
Oh, wow.
I remember being in my grandfather's basement, and I was playing this old, you would laugh if you heard it. It's like the most monotonous, old, unfun music that you can imagine. I was playing it in this cassette tape, but upstairs, I guess the way the bass was shaking the rafters, it sounded like a drum. And I don't think it had a single drum in the music, but my grandfather stormed down there and he's angry at me and he's saying, "We don't listen to that devil music here."
Wow.
And it's
Wait,
like
just any drums?
just any drums, man.
Like hand drums, and it wasn't like just any type of percussion?
They did not like percussion, and I really don't know
That's
why,
crazy.
because it shifted over time. The
Right.
guitars. So in the sect that I was in, William Branham told my grandfather that any instrument that had strings was the devil's music. And so the Branham Tabernacle has an organ and it has a piano, and that's it. That's all you're allowed. And I remember growing up, I'm a musician, I'm a critical thinker. I've always been a critical thinker.
Right.
And they told me this, and I'm like, well, do you guys not know that piano has strings in it? Yeah, so everything in here is a statement, but you're talking about the repetitions, and that's part of the reason why I no longer listen to Christian music. I do sometimes, but for the most part, I just don't enjoy it. Because after leaving, I swore I wasn't going to change. I loved my music. I have always loved my music. I've got all kinds of albums of my music, of me playing and singing and writing music. And then after I left, I realized that as I'm listening to this music and I'm learning about how manipulation works and why and how I was manipulated, I started noticing the same patterns of manipulation from the sermons that I'd heard. I started noticing some of those patterns were also in the music. And some of them had to do with repetition. They would just repeat this phrase over and over and over. And sometimes the phrase might be some theology that's just out in left field. It's not even biblical, but you're repeating over and over and over, and it gets stuck in your head. And we're talking about the prophecy. So William Branham mentioned how he entered into the prophetic. And this is on recording. This is in front of a bunch of adult people. He says, "Now, whenever I enter into prophecy, my brother, I start chanting in my head, 2 + 2 = 4. 2 + 2 = 4. And I say this over and over.
Really?
And he's talking about getting himself in a trance through vain repetitions.
Oh, wow.
And it's crazy if you think about the spiritual. He was in Indiana where spiritualism was heavy during his era. But I started thinking about the vain repetitions in the music, especially some of the more modern style music. And it's the same kind of thing. They want to get your head into this state where they can easily inject whatever it is they want to put in your head through the music.
Wow. That's crazy. And that makes so much sense with, I think that, you have a lot of music that is just repetitive because it's uninspired, because it's just, we got to do something and we got to, less insidious, I think, but just like, hey, the 4/4, these 4 chords, have been proven to work. Everyone's familiar with them. We're going to do, verse, chorus, verse, bridge, whatever, like the formulaic. So there's like the formulaic aspect of Christian music that is just, uninspired. But then there's also the more insidious sort of like repetitive nature of the like cult music, the more mind control. And I definitely think that the International House of Prayer, like I grew up in the prayer room listening to hours. I mean, I would be in the prayer room for 8 hours straight, listening to music where it was just sort of the same ideas being repeated over and over and over again. And I think of this one artist who a lot of people still like him, and I'm going to be saying his name because people will be familiar with it. But John Thurlow was this worship leader who would lead. It was Tuesdays at 10 a.m. I think it was, but it was 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. And for all of my high school, I would go to these sets, and he would do these like meditative sets that were 2-hour sets that they would just like focus on a single passage. And I think for like 6 straight months, he just did a lot of music on John 1. Like the word was, now that I'm even forgetting what it is, means that it's been a while since.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Again, this is just hitting parts of my brain that I have not touched since in a long time. But we like that same verse was repeated thousands of times each 2-hour section, and then next Tuesday it would be the same and the same and the same. And he was a good musician, and I think that he was trying to I don't want to be throwing shade on him, but it was this sort of very repetitive, very enforcing this sort of central biblical principles that they were being taught. And then usually then there would be more specific verses or chants about Israel, like the harp and bowl method. We would have people get up and pray about Jesus returning and about Israel, and very politically charged, very like American Christian Zionists, some vaguely anti-Semitic stuff too, about when the Jews become Christian, then there will be a revival and until they're saved. And this, I remember a lot of language around that, and a lot of language around the anguish of the Lord not returning. I mean, Misty Edwards. Have you listened to much of Misty Edwards' music?
I have not.
Okay, but you should listen to it. Just when you get a free chance, you should listen to it, because it's kind of wild when you do listen to it, because immediately you're going to be shocked by the lyrics. The music itself is it was very edgy for charismatic Christian world, especially in the early 2000s, 2010s, when she was becoming very prominent. But she was this talented vocalist out of and music writer out of Kansas City. She became very well known even within the larger Christian world. A lot of her music would be familiar to listeners of the show, I'm sure. But it was very interesting growing up in that world, because the lyrics of her song were filled with this anguish and a sort of lovesick nature. And they were really explicitly sexual. And there was always this kind of confusion of whether or not she knew what she was talking about.
Wow.
Whether was she just the most sheltered, unaware individual who just didn't understand that all of her music was double entendres, and that was very, very sexual. And then turns out that we've talked about the bridal paradigm in the past, and how this was one of the central doctrines that Mike Bickle latched onto, is this idea that this metaphor of Christ being the bridegroom and the church being the bride, and this sort of lovesick longing that one day Jesus will return, and is very apocalyptic in that sense, that we are waiting for the return of God that will happen one day in our lifetime, but it's sometime in the future and it's mysterious, and until that day we are going to have this sort of lovesick longing that like we will never be complete, we'll never be perfect, we'll never be like have this part of ourselves, there will always be a part of ourselves missing until Jesus returns. And meanwhile, Bickle was using that same sort of terminology and that same metaphor to groom young women. Like it was explicitly the same tactic that he was using to have teenagers and children like become enraptured by him, where he would groom these young women and tell them that one day they will be together, that one day in the future, and he would give prophecies about how he and whatever victim he was talking to would one day be together, and these wrongs would be made right, and one day it's going to happen, and this lovesick longing will suddenly be fulfilled. And he was absolutely telling these things to Misty Edwards. And also Misty Edwards, this has been written about, was having a very like abusive, toxic relationship with someone who was extremely controlling, not just Mike, but there was another man named Kevin Brush, and a worship leader, who was like explicitly blackmailing her in relationships, just really, really depressing, heartbreaking stuff. And so in her music, you hear this like anguish and this genuine, real emotion. And I think that that's why people really gravitated towards it, because in a community where not a whole lot of genuine emotion was expressed, a lot of like these formulaic sort of cookie cutter songs were being made, you suddenly had this individual who was expressing this very loaded, very sexual, and very like emotional, agonizing music. And everybody that I knew was captivated by this music, and it would be played live, and it would we had these One Thing conferences where we'd pack out Bridal Hall, and I mean, it was the largest sort of, other than like Kansas City Chiefs football games, it was like the largest gatherings that I was continually a part of, where there was like thousands and thousands of people in this large room, and everybody sort of agonizing over this music of like this lovesick sort of like, please return, Jesus, please make me whole, like I am nothing and you are everything, and I am sick and you shall make me whole, and I drop to my knees in pain. Like this is all sort of like the metaphor. Obviously the language was extremely different. I could give the actual language, but again, it is explicitly sexual, and so I don't want you to get
YouTube might filter.
I don't want you to get you demonetized, and also I would turn red saying it, because it's just but people can look it up and listen to it and know that I'm not just making stuff up here. Like that was what was going on. And so it's just really this marriage between the music and the prophecy is so fascinating to me.
See, I'm one of the few people that I have more fun when people are poking jokes at me than I do of making fun of other people. And so for the first 37 years of my life, I truly was naive. But somewhere along those 37 years, there comes a point in every adult's life whenever you suddenly start to realize what other people are saying and the language they're using. And I chose, because I like people I like to see people laugh. I chose to continue pretending to be naive, even though I knew what they were talking about and knew what they're saying. And I would purposefully just drop the most obvious double entendre, make the whole room start laughing. And then I also had the ability to keep a fully straight face.
Oh, so I believe it. Yeah.
I'm just acting fully naive. Everybody's laughing at me, and I'm like, what are you guys laughing at? But I don't know that I could do that in a church. But, to your point, music is something, it fascinates me. As a songwriter, as a composer, you really get to see what's inside of a person. It is like a window just opening up into the soul. Because whatever they're going through, whenever I was towards the end of being in a cult, I was in deep, deep depression. And it was painful going through it. Some of my best music and songs came to me, and I was having so many songs coming at that time that, like, I'd be driving down the road and the song would hit me. I actually have forgotten more songs than I wrote down because they just keep coming, and you get to see what's inside of a person. So it's fascinating to me when I experience the helping somebody who's been in a different cult than I grew up in, or even a different splinter group. If you can get into their music that was written by the people in that sect, you can kind of see what the sect is all about. So it's also this way, it's like a blueprint of a schematic of the mappings of their souls inside of this movement.
Totally. And I think that there's also this tension that arises because like you said, you in these communities, you're also not allowed to, depending on the rules, the very arbitrary, ridiculous rules of whatever subset you're a part of, you know, have these rules about the type of music you make, or whether you can use drums or not, or whether, you know, visible strings are present, you know, like that's which you even talking about that is crazy to me, because like I have never even heard of that. And it's wild to me that our sects that we grew up in are really not that far apart from each other, yet they have wildly different rules and wildly different boundaries. And it shows how kind of arbitrary and pointless a lot of these are, is that, you know, 10, 20 years later, the subgroups that were birthed out of the message cult don't have any of these same boundaries, because they're kind of silly, and like drums are good to have in your music. And but anyway, the point is too, there of course are like restrictions, because you don't want, if you're in a cult community, you don't want people making music or being open to music that is worldly music, whatever that means, whatever is of the world. So whether that's, you know, rap or hip hop, or whether that's using drums or using electric guitar, or this type of, you know, experimental music, all of these things will be forbidden, because there's this idea of like, we need to separate ourselves from the world. And also like emotions. What emotions are you allowed to have and express within these communities? Like for me, when I grew up, like I couldn't express doubt. I couldn't express anger with the world that I grew up in. You know, I could express anger with the rest of the world, but I couldn't sort of express any form of discontent. I couldn't, a lot of these negative emotions that I had, or emotions that weren't beneficial to the cult community, were like strictly forbidden. And I couldn't sing about those. I couldn't, you know, I couldn't explore that emotion at all. And I couldn't explore ideas that were outside of the conventional ideas. And I think that this is what's really interesting, is that you have this, like, you have all of these musicians who are a part of these worlds that are handcuffed. I mean, they're having to play music with two hands tied behind their back, and not express this particular type of emotion, or use this type of music, or otherwise they'll be criticized. But every once in a while, you have some like genuine emotion slip out between the cracks with the music. And like you said, that's when you really get to get a picture of what the community genuinely is when these cracks open up and you get to hear the music, and you get to hear what people are actually really thinking.
Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the new Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support. As I said, this room that I'm in is kind of counterculture to the cult that I was in. And
Right.
I wish I could show you above my monitors. I've got these little figurines that whenever I've had news reporters and journalists come into my office, and the first thing to do when they see these figurines, they're like, what in the world? This feels out of place. In the right-hand corner, I've got the little figurines of the Kiss band, with all the makeup and all the... And it's counterculture because we grew up in a culture that was so heavily against that. And by and large, it wasn't even just the message cult. You had all of these propaganda preachers saying things like, this is knights in Satan's service. You watch so your kids don't get abducted by these guys. And me, a critical thinker, I want to know all things. So when I first discovered that the name actually came because... what's his name? Peter Criss, I think, the band member. He came from a band that was called Lips. And so as a statement against Lips, they created Kiss, which was kind of funny history. There's a documentary on, I think it's Hulu that I watched, a great documentary of the band. And it's not my favorite band. It's not my favorite music, but it's a statement, as is the rest of this room, because I'm countering the culture that I came from.
Right.
And what's interesting is what we were in, both you and I, we were in a religious counterculture. What these groups did, they wanted to take whatever is the current status quo in the world and say, this is evil, come to us, we're better than the evil, and we will protect your kids, we will bring you into heavenly bliss. That's how it works. And what's funny is you can examine the music over decades, and you can see how this has changed and evolved. Because, so I've been out of the cult. We left January 1st, 2012. So from that time until now, the music that I listened to then, people would think is old-timey and out of date and no fun.
Right.
And the music they listen to now, my former self would say, well, that's devil music because we've been preached at left and right that this is devil music. And yet the music they're listening to now isn't current. It's from like 10 years behind. So they're kind of like always a decade behind. And you can go all the way back through time. In my research, I've tied basically Christian fundamentalism merged with Pentecostalism to form and create Branhamism, which created Latter Rain and created IHOP. All of this was built on counterculture. And the things that they preached out in one decade, the next decade they would readily adopt it because the culture has changed and it's no longer popular. And then whatever they're preaching at during that decade, give it another decade and they're allowing it and they're preaching against what was current then. So as you watch it change through time, you can watch these changes also happen in the music. What's allowed to be as music styles, as music genres, what's allowed in the lyrics, what's allowed in the structure of the music, all of that seems to shift and change. And I began to notice this. So I mentioned my grandfather, the church didn't allow strings. Well, my grandfather was an evangelist, and he toured with aunts and uncles who played stringed instruments. And William Branham, the narcissist, said, "No, you're gonna stop this. That's the devil's music." And I came across a photograph of him, William Branham, playing a guitar, and I was like, "No, this doesn't make sense." He was against the guitar. I was not allowed to play for many, many years because of this. And then even when I was allowed to play, it was this big battle in my family because I had a guitar. Well, he had one, and then I began researching further back in time. The church that my grandfather preaches at, the Branham Tabernacle, when it was created filled with music. They had choirs, and they had choir directors, and they had a traveling music band that came out of the honky-tonks. And I guess they would play in the honky-tonks, and then they would come play in the tabernacle, and then they would go on the road, and they were winning awards for their music. So over time, this shifted as a counterculture. As music gets to be popular, they started preaching against it, and the music began to change and evolve into this very slow organ-y style music. I don't know if you've heard any of this, but it's the kind of stuff that I would say puts you to sleep, but it's so monotonous it would probably wake you up.
Well, and repetitive and emulating a previous era's type of music, which the idea that in our community we were always 10, 20 years behind culture in the art that we were producing, because there was this cycle of there was always a tension. You had on one hand, you wanted to separate, like you said, countercultural. You want to be different than the culture at the time. You want to not be doing the same pop music or styles, or even a lot of xenophobia was rooted in this. There was a lot of fear on what was different and what was of the world. And so people would separate themselves from that. But then yet 10 years later, you would be like, okay, well, but this music with the drums and the electric guitar, a lot of people are listening to. And we want to be evangelists. We want people to come and appreciate that which we do. And if you're not, well, you and I have talked a ton about how the miracles and the miracle performance of prophecy and healing was the primary way that these communities drew people in. But more recently, I think it's been more about the music, about using music to draw people in. And that was true too, but the traveling bands in the past, having something to engage the people. And so then it becomes this question of okay, well, we want to create music that is appealing to people. So then you start looking at the world and being what is music that is appealing over here? And so 10 years after it became popular, or 20 years after it became popular, you see these communities starting to adopt the very things that they said were of the devil, because it's kind of become grafted into society, and they're trying to entice people in. They're trying to create rock music to bring people in. But the thing is, and this is the problem, and I know this very deeply because I was very much a part of this. When I went to YWAM, I went to be a part of this organization that was creating, that was filmmaking. And our whole idea was bringing the Bible into popular culture. And we were we want to make good movies that even a secular audience really loves, that it has all of these Christian values. But the problem is that we didn't have a whole lot of respect for other communities. We didn't have respect for other traditions and the way that these whether music or film or whatever, the art itself, the process in which it was developed, we didn't have any respect for. So of course we weren't going to emulate good art, because we didn't understand the art. We were just trying to, make our best imitation of stuff we thought was successful. And of course it was not good.
I can't tell you how many sermons that I have heard about how music with a beat is the devil trying to entice your children. And that's not just the Branham cults. I've heard this in Pentecostal church. I think I've even heard this in one of the modern denominational churches that I've been to. They try to scare you, I guess is the best way to put it, that you might accidentally catch a demon through the music. That's really what they're trying to do. And again, my critical thinking just, do you not know that every music has a beat, and that's how it forms music? It has to have a beat. But what's interesting is I can't remember if I've mentioned this before or not, but In the Branham cults, the theme song was Only Believe, written by Paul Rader, who was key into the fundamentalist and the Christian identity cults. And so he wanted to make this music that was appealing to the modern culture, because the way these counterculture religions work is they grow, they get enough members, and then they just shut off the culture. And they start preaching against the current culture. Well, people get tired of it, and so it kind of diminishes a little bit. And then they have to say, well, we must make ourselves more appealing. We need to draw in bigger crowds. So they start adopting what was maybe not modern culture, but at least a decade ahead. So then they start bringing new people in. Well, I found newspaper articles talking about the composition of the song Only Believe, which if you heard it now, it's like elevator music Christianity.
Right.
It's not that great. But back then, apparently it was stunning to the Pentecostal community because they were bringing in a beat and make it in a jazzy style. They specifically took some of the beats of Latin America and Africa and kind of made it to where it would kind of resemble this to be more appealing so that it would attract bigger crowds. Decades later, Elvis Presley sings it. Elvis is one of the people who was heavily preached against all throughout fundamentalist evangelical Christianity. Is Elvis or the Beatles? You're going to preach against the two popular ones, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I'll never forget, after leaving, it was probably a year after leaving the cult, I heard my first Beatles song and I did the thing where I would chant or I would play music in my head when I heard secular music so that I didn't catch this accidental demon. So I'd never really listened to it. And the first time I heard it, I was like, dang, this isn't very good. It's really, I mean, it's good, but it's old. It's not even half as scary as what they were trying to teach me. But they've created this counterculture, and through time they start adopting what was the previous counterculture that they were speaking against. And in doing so, it's really weird. Like I said, I've left the Branham religion since January 1st, 2012. The music they listen to now is completely different than I was allowed to listen to, and I'm just shocked when I see the changes.
Well, on one hand, I will say, if I started my own cult, I would probably also preach against beats just to hide the fact that I have no sense of rhythm, and to just make it so I get that. No, I'm obviously kidding, but I this cycle of like preaching against a thing because it's demonic, it becoming a fixture of pop culture, largely, so much so that it becomes sort of inert. It becomes less offensive because like it is now familiar. Then the church adopts the very thing that was once demonic in order to draw crowds in, while then now finding a new thing to call demonic, a new, something different. If it was rock music and the Beatles in the 1960s and the 1970s, then now it's in the 1990s and 80 or 1990s and the early aughts, it's like rap music or hip hop music, and now it would be electronica music or still rap. I don't know. I have no idea what's being preached against in contemporary churches, but it's always this weird cycle of like forbid the thing, then once it becomes sort of inert, adopt the thing and try to pretend like you didn't ban it 10 years previously.
After leaving the Branham cult, like I said, I don't enjoy listening to Christian music anymore because it was used as a manipulation tool. And unfortunately, I think I've mentioned this in the podcast I had with Adam, which will come out before this one. But Bethel music just was so popular, and the style of worship that they led, everything began to integrate itself into Christian music until it became all of these vain repetitions that just, for me, it's really scary, because this is this is an indoctrination tool. Whether it's good or bad, whatever they're saying with the lyrics, that's for you to decide. But the manipulation of it, that aspect just bothers me. So I can't listen to it. But in one of the churches we attended, there was a group of people going to hear a Christian rock band, and I don't enjoy Christian rock. It's not my thing. And I've heard a little bit of it, and it's, I've heard real guitarists that can just really brilliantly play the guitar, and then you hear this Christian rock stuff and you're like, could you not find anybody better than this? But I will say, I went, and a majority of the music was just repeated phrases, and I was like tuning it out. I don't want you in my head. And then this group came out that was different than everybody else. And so the rest of the groups, they would walk out on the stage like you would normally expect, grab the microphone, sing their repetitions over and over and over and over and over and over, and then they would leave, and I was blocking, mentally. Well, this group walks out, and there's these two Asian ladies dressed in tuxedos holding a violin like this, which was different. And I was like, that's different. That's cool. They walk out, and they're on either side, and then the main band walks out. There's a girl playing the drums, which was really, that idea was foreign to me. At that point in time, I had not yet discovered Karen Carpenter, so it was it was unique to me. But they walk out, the girl gets on the drums, and then all of a sudden they start jamming, and the two Asian ladies on the violins, underneath them, this pillar just lifted them way up into the air. And the smoke billows out, and they started shredding the violin. Best violinist that I've ever heard. That music was amazing, and yet at the same time, it still had these repeated phrases over and over and over.
Because that does sound very spectacular. It also is, it gets at the grandiose nature of how Christian music is kind of becoming now. Like, it's becoming a spectacle, which I'm both fine with, and like it's problematic insofar as like there's still the whole Bethel hero worship that is involved with that, where now it's not just the prophets, it's the musicians who are also given this sort of like celebrity status, because when you're lifted on a pillar and there's smoke behind you, you start becoming a celebrity. But also, it's kind of cool. So at least they're doing something fresh and new. I always think of that with like, you go to you go to museums and you see all of the art that was made in the Renaissance. And I think that beautiful art can come out of even cloistered religious communities, because again, sometimes it's the only emotional expression within that community. And so you can have these really powerful things that sort of break the mold, and give very like genuine expression. And like at the International House of Prayer, you talk about could have gotten better musicians. There were really, really good musicians at the International House of Prayer. And part of that was because they were playing music so much. I mean, their job is just to play music. Now, unfortunately, they were only playing certain type of music over and over and over again. So how much that like makes you expand your talent. But like, as far as just becoming masters and tacticians, masters of their technical ability. There was a lot of really, really talented musicians, and if they weren't talented, then they trial by fire. Like, you have to learn very quickly to become good. And so I think that it is fascinating. What's fascinating too is my dad when he would prophesy, he would often have musicians come up and play music behind him, whether piano, whether guitar, usually, some of that softer music to kind of give this sort of gravity, and it became a part of his like prophetic performance. So, and there was some really talented. There's this man named Luke Hendrickson, great dude, great individual, great piano player, and he would travel a lot with my dad, and he would come and he would play music, play the piano behind my dad, and it gave so much gravity. I remember just so many of these incredibly emotional performances of my dad has preached for 45 minutes to an hour to maybe more than that, because, you know, you go long in the charismatic church, of course. And he's not prophesied at all. He's just talked about different stories and whatnot. And then it was all kind of leading up. You would always put the prophecy at the end so that people wouldn't leave before, you know, it's like putting the sales at the back of the store to make sure that everybody walks through the whole store and hears the whole sermon, so that they stick around and pay attention, so that if their name is called, you know, it happens at the end, and to like end on this emotional high. But he would have Luke or someone come up and start playing music behind him, and it really made a difference. And it gets you into this place, this emotional place, where then your name is called out, and you have this live music and incredible incredible musicians who know how to ebb and flow with the tone of what is being said, when there's like a crescendo and this sort of brought to climax of like the prophetic. As he starts talking, it starts out soft and then it grows, and as he's giving his powerful, this is what you will do and you will change nations, the music crescendos behind him, and it became like a very, very powerful performance art. And I understand why people could become totally enraptured by these things. And that's the whole idea of the harp and bowl model, is that, you know, if you were just sitting there chanting, you know, the word was with God and the word was God. And again, I can't believe that I'm messing it up now. I should know John 1.
Well, and the irony of it is that was a passage that was repeated over and over and over and over in the Branham cults, because that was the key
really?
manifested sons of God passage.
Oh,
the word became flesh. Well, now we have the spoken word. Now we have what people today call the word of knowledge. That we have this thing that's the word being made manifest among us. So that the fact that was put into the lyrics, I think, drives the point of all of this for me home.
Yeah.
Because I don't have a problem with music. I love all kinds of music. If you look at my playlist, I've got everything from classical to polka to rock and roll to everything. I love music, right?
Yeah.
When I was in the cult, it was like a painter being told I could only paint with the color green. I like all music. But as a songwriter, I can tell you, at least for me, and I'm curious if other songwriters are listening, give me feedback in the comments. As a songwriter, I never get a song come to me that has a repeated phrase over and over and over and over and over and over again. That doesn't happen when you're a songwriter. It just doesn't happen. The only way in which that happens is if you are a person who knows how to manipulate a crowd and you know how to get something that's stuck in their head. Well, then you have the power to choose what it is that's getting stuck in their head. And for me, out of all of this, that's the most scary part.
It's not just that's where the music comes with it. Like it's the repeating of the melody that we don't cycle through different. It's not jazz where you're going in all separate directions and there's never resolution. It's you have these very cyclical sort of melodies paired with this repeated language. And so it becomes stuck in your head and it continues to repeat and repeat. And what happens too is that you're forbidden to listen to other music outside of that music, which this was definitely a thing. Like my community was less strict on like the type of music that we would play or the type of instruments that we would play within the community. But I, of course, was forbidden to listen to anything that was considered secular music. And I remember having an argument with one of the leaders of the sort of like youth pastors. I remember being like, does Mozart count as secular music? Because it's not Christian music, you know? And he was like, does it bring you closer to God? And I was like, yeah, sure, of course it does. And then I was like, if that's the question, I'm having a spiritual experience to the Beatles or whatever, you know, like then we could totally open it up. And it was so funny because so I wasn't allowed to listen to any music that wasn't Christian. But I grew up in the era of tapes and CDs, and the way that I got new music is I would go with my grandma to Mardell's. Do you know what Mardell's is?
I don't.
It's like a Christian department store. It's like I think it's in conjunction with Hobby Lobby or they're close to it or whatever. But you go in there and it had, you know, VeggieTale t-shirts and everything that was like Christian. And so they would have a whole music section and it was all the Christian music. And my grandma would let me go, and you could pick out CDs and you could play them. They had like their own little CD players there, so you could sample all the music. And she would always be like, you can pick one, you know, album. And she kind of was like, well, this is all Christian music. She didn't also care. My parents were way more strict. My grandma was like secretly teaching me how to like play poker and stuff like that. Like she was fantastic and was like she was not stricter part of that community at all. So she didn't care, but she respected my parents and stuff. But she was like, okay, well, we're in a Christian music or in a Christian store, so like all of this music must be fine. And I got into a lot of the like Christian punk rock scene because that was like the most edgy thing that I could find in it. And I know that you might not be familiar with it, but like the Reliant K and Anne Berlin and all of these different like artists who like even the like punk screamo Christian music I would listen to as well, and that was so edgy and whatnot. But I was having all of these very like spiritual, emotional, artistic experiences because I was suddenly able to listen to music that I had like never heard before. And now I listen back to it and I'm like, it really wasn't that great. Like it was pretty formulaic. It was pretty like pretending to be what, you know, Jimmy Eat World and these other more like secular pop punk bands and stuff like that. But that was sort of my exposure to music that had more emotion in it than like the conventional worship music. And I think that it's pretty downright pretty insidious to cloister off people's sort of artistic experiences, especially when it has to do with like children and growing up, being like, hey, all of this other music you can't listen to, these types of movies you can't watch, these types of like just artistic experiences are closed off. And I think it's done so that your only emotional artistic experiences are happening at your worship service, that they then these repetitive cult-like trance-like music that you are allowed to experience, that becomes your sort of only channel into experiencing art. And what's funny is that like I get why they do it, because like as soon as I started listening to music that was different and started expanding my horizons, that's that started the unraveling of my whole faith in the community, because I was like, there is a lot of like better moving, more interesting things that are going on. We are supposed to be the light on the hill. We are supposed to be like the pinnacle of culture. We are supposed to be saying stuff that is more profound than everyone else. This is the idea that is being presented in the community that I'm in. And like, I am listening to other music and I'm realizing we don't have anything worthwhile, like, or comparatively, like this music that is beyond us is so much more interesting, compelling, and emotional than what we have. And like, I get why then you try to like, if you want to control people, you want to force them to only worship your music. They only listen and experience and have, you want to have pure access to people's emotional experiences. And this like politics that surrounded music was one of the primary ways in which that happened.
Yeah, I think that is one of the key concepts to understanding how it was a religious counterculture. I'm a sci-fi fan too, and right here is the Millennium Falcon. I don't know if you can see it, but in every episode we do, the Millennium Falcon from Star Wars is right there.
Yeah.
And but I'm a sci-fi fan and fantasy fan, and there's this concept that you've probably seen it in various movies, especially recently, where you've got this city that everything's kind of okay, and then suddenly they're inside of this wall, and then suddenly there's this hole in the wall, and people see the other side. And once they see the other side, well, why are we in here? Why are we stuck in here? And so there's this big journey to the other side, right? That whole concept exists because of what we're talking about. When you have a religious counterculture that has built mental walls around your head, they can't keep you from seeing what's on the other side, and so they have to adapt and make it more appealing. But once you experience what's on the other side, my grandfather would say, they went out of us because they were not of us. And so basically, once you see the other side and you experience the other side, a lot of people just say, well, heck with this. I don't want to be trapped in here. You're not going to tell me what to do. And so they break the counterculture religion. But that concept is really what we're talking about today. And all of the music and the way that they manipulate your head, it's all tools to keep you in those walls and those boundaries mentally. So, well, this is excessively fun. I could talk about music probably for the next 10 hours. So
I think it's great. Yeah.
I think we're over, so we'll stop here, but thank you for doing this.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Well, if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more about the dark side of the New Apostolic Reformation, read Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR. Available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.